Actually, the 10 arenas are areas of life. So, for example, these are goals that we have. And just like with physical fitness, you wouldn't start as a marathon runner. You would start maybe walking, or you would start with cutting back sugar or caffeine. You would pick one area. And so when I deal with patients and we're working on mental fitness, we usually pick one area and usually one aspect of one area that they most want to improve. So if they come and they're having incredible relationship issues, we would look at what does it look like to be mentally fit when it comes to relationships,
So
or if they're having work
what does
issues
that look like to be mentally fit in a relationship?
in relationships. So, there's there's five that I consider superpowers. So when we talk about being mentally fit in general, we're talking about having awareness. So when we talk about superpowers, is probably the best way to answer that question. So some of the superpowers of mental fitness, the first one is flexibility, cognitive flexibility. So if you're stuck in your own perspective and you don't know how to get out of that perspective, you're going to have trouble in relationships, right? Because all you can see is your particular viewpoint. So to be cognitively flexible means I'm going to kind of try my best to get behind your eyes and wonder what you might be thinking that leads you, to say these things to me, or leads you to react to some way that I'm doing, right? So cognitive flexibility is one of them. Another one is, and this may sound it may sound strange, but love is another superpower for mental fitness. And it's because if we're in a state of love, we're more likely to be compassionate, we're more likely to be forgiving, we're more likely to be concerned about the welfare of others and ourselves, right? And so love is a superpower. When we hold someone else in high esteem, even when our love isn't perfect, we're going to be more flexible. So all of these dovetail into each other. The third superpower I would call self-awareness. So self-awareness is awareness of your emotions, what I'm feeling in the moment, how I'm being triggered, what you're doing that I think is triggering me, what consistently creates positive emotions, what consistently creates negative emotions. Not that we have the answer to all of them all at once, but that awareness is really important. You can't change something that you're not aware of. The
So
next
what
one
would,
is,
mm.
go ahead.
Oh, so what would be some of the other types of mental fitness other than in relationship?
Okay, so other types of mental fitness, the 10 areas, that if we're looking at the big picture that we're working toward, is your emotional tendencies. So being able to regulate your emotions, being able to be aware of your emotions. The next one would be thought processes, how you're perceiving things, what beliefs that you hold as being true, whether that's accurate or not. Your behavioral habits, what positive and negative habits do you have? Close relationships, which is, romantic relationships, children and family, social relationships more broadly, which is friends, community, co-workers and acquaintances, work and productivity, self-care, so health, fitness, sufficient rest, work-life balance, recreation and leisure, as well as creativity. So are we taking time to have fun, to enjoy life and not just work, work, work? And then the last two are spiritual health, and then what I call legacy issues. So what do you want to leave behind? What do you want to be known by? So those are just the big 10 areas that someone may land in my office. Usually one of those is what we're working on.
That's great. Well, I like that idea that you could just work on one at a time. And also what I always say is even if you get stuck on one, you can focus on another. So you can always have a sense of moving forward. So
Yeah, and the idea is that these 10 areas, as you improve some in this one and some in this one and some in this one, it's cumulative and additive. So the more areas that you have at least some skills in, the more likely you are to respond skillfully in any one of the areas, right? And the converse is true. The less skills you have in more areas, the more likely you're to respond not appropriately. So it is beautiful. But the analogy I would use is, we always talk about things snowball on us, and we usually use that as a negative term. Yeah, but as you work with skills, it snowballs in a good way.
Yes. So I agree with all of this, but what's your view of where skills come from?
Yeah, skills are learned. Sometimes we're taught in our families, our core family of origin. A lot of times we're not. A lot of times we're, modeled very negative skills instead of positive ones. So all skills, whether good or bad, are learned, which is glorious because it means we can learn them. You don't have to be born with them.
So what does it take to learn them?
Practice, 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 practice. So, you do have to develop some self-awareness. In other words, you got to know what your deficits are, and we spend a fair amount of time at the onset figuring out what's working and what's not working. And once you have that self-awareness, then the next thing we do is develop a target. What's the outcome you would actually like? And then once we develop that target, what are all the little pieces along the way that you need to do that? And then it is practice, practice, practice,
Yes,
just like riding a
exactly.
bike.
Yes, well, I say it like training a dog.
Yes. Well, there you go. That's more in line with yours.
Or a horse, or the animal of your
Mm.
choice, a seal. um, my inner seal.
How about the otters, the sea otters? I just love the little otters.
Are they trainable? I wonder.
I would bet so. They're certainly trainable by, they know where to go for food. They know how to flip over on their back and use that little, rock or whatever to break they had to learn that somewhere.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And they're not born with it, and they learn out
Hmm.
of hunger. That's a big factor in my new book. I talk about how hunger is really the motivator of most mammalian behavior and most
Hmm.
skill learning. So
Hmm.
that means if you're not hungry, if your child is not hungry, you're not going to maybe see the motivation that you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah. So, in our prior discussions, we talked about the happy brain chemicals and, how you can take action to be able to, recreate pathways or um, increase the happy chemicals versus having this cascade of cortisol. And so it just made me think about my thought about not rehearsing problems. Instead, we're going to visit the past very briefly to inform what we're doing, but then we're really looking forward, because if we want to lay down new pathways, we don't want to keep rehearsing the past. So my question, to you would be, what do you see from your perspective about just talking about problems over and over again? How does that impact the brain?
Well, I absolutely agree with what you said, that we do need to identify the core pattern so that we can be aware that it is just a neural pathway rather than reality.
Mhm.
Because if you don't know it's a pathway, you don't know that you're filtering the world through that pathway and creating the illusion
Mhm.
that this early experience is happening right now. And yet, if you just keep talking about the old pattern, then you don't get a chance to build a new pattern. Now, I think most therapists these days do not endlessly dwell on the old pattern, but
Mhm.
the average person does, and so many people, like when
Mhm.
you say rehearse, it's a good word for it, because that's effectively what people do. But it's often the definition of friendship. People get together and just go over and over, their victim story, and you're expected to reinforce another person's victim story, or else you're considered a bad person. Then you expect them to reciprocate by reinforcing your victim story.
Mhm.
But I think people need to understand that they have power to create new neural pathways. So the first step is
Mhm.
understanding that your responses are just a neural pathway, and then to know that you can create a new neural pathway, but it's hard work. It doesn't come easily. It comes easily when you're a child, which is how these things get so deeply wired in. But learning a new pathway in adulthood is exactly like learning a foreign language in adulthood, that it's so hard that most people don't even do it. And yet we all learned a foreign language. We learned a language effortlessly when we were 2 years old because we have so much neuroplasticity when we're young. So I think metaphors are the way to help people understand. So first, I think of like your old neural pathway is like a river. And when you want to build a new neural pathway, it's like a straw because it's so hard to build new neural pathways in adulthood. So how do you get a river to flow into a straw? It's very hard. And that's why, like with repetition, you build that new road. But I also like to think of it as an exit ramp. So your old thought loop is a highway. Your new neural pathway is just a tiny trail because it's so hard to carve a new trail in the jungle. It takes so much work to open a new path in the jungle.
Right.
So you have to do a lot of repetition, but you need an exit ramp to get off that old highway to enter that new trail. And the exit ramp is what you keep calling awareness, so the idea of saying,
Mm-hmm.
oh, wait a minute, I'm having this response because of my old neural pathway, but I have this new neural pathway, which is not so easy to flow into, but I can keep building it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, a couple things I want to mention in case, depending on who our listeners are. And one is, it's not to say, for example, with a case of trauma, some people really want to suppress and not even think about those previous. So when we say not rehearsing problems, that's not to say that sometimes we don't need to talk about the trauma so that we don't get into an avoidance loop. Because, for example, with post-traumatic stress disorder, they want to avoid it at all cost. But then I think of it, the way I always explain it to the veterans is, if you have a splinter in your thumb, the body is always trying to push it up and out. Sometimes it'll even wrap it around in a little pocket. And so when it starts coming to the surface, if all you did was shove it down constantly, I mean, what's the risk you're running? Infection. I mean, you could wind up with a serious infection.
That's a
So I think
fabulous
of
metaphor.
psychological,
Very good.
yeah, I think of psychological trauma as being similar. So if we just try to shove it down, mind and body is going, wait, I'm in pain here. We need to deal with this. And keeps trying to send you the message back up and out. So sometimes we do need to do that initial speaking. And then the other comment that I have was that when we have friendships and we are talking about similar problems, it's a bonding experience. There's nothing wrong with that. And so briefly talk about it, but it's when you do it over and over and over again to the point that you're stuck on it and can't move past it that it becomes a problem. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Well, that's very helpful. And I'll give you my specific situation about this that I'm sure you've noticed. So people listen to the news, and then that becomes what they rehearse is, oh, the world is so awful because of X. And whatever
Mm,
was in the news today, that's the X. And then that's the bonding experience. And so maybe X changes, but the core perception that the world is awful and that our lives are awful is never challenged. And I just don't
mm.
agree with this. And I think it's so unhealthy. And so when I'm with people, and I've sort of noticed that if you say that, you get a sort of bad reaction. So I've sort of given up. But I
Yeah,
try to tell
yeah.
people I don't listen to the news. I don't want to
Hmm.
wash myself in negativity all the time. And I think people have a bad reaction to that they either think, well, you're not informed, you're not doing your share as a citizen, or it's like, well, then you don't understand me, and you don't that's my whole life. So if you're rejecting politics, then you're rejecting my whole life.